Hey everyone, and welcome to This Explainer. Today we are unpacking the actual architecture of psychiatry. Clinical terminology can seem really dense and overlapping, but understanding how experts actually define, categorize, and treat the mind, it reveals an absolutely fascinating evolution of modern medicine. So let's get started.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here's our roadmap for our highly organized journey today. We're going to define the mental health field, take a brief historical journey, and then unpack the biopsychosocial model. After that, we'll clarify the crucial difference between disorders and diseases and wrap the whole thing up with modern diagnostic frameworks.
Section 1, defining the mental health field. And we are going to start right off by clearing up some fundamental modern misconceptions. Pop culture gets this wrong all the time, blurring the lines. But the clinical divide is actually really sharp. A psychiatrist is a medical doctor. They diagnose and can prescribe pharmacological treatments, like drugs, alongside therapy. Conversely, psychologists and social workers focus entirely on the psychosocial architecture of a disorder. They're utilizing talk therapy and environmental interventions, not medication. So it's very much a multidisciplinary team effort, but their distinct qualifications dictate entirely different treatment pathways. So when evaluating a patient, what are these professionals actually looking at? Well, they're measuring the core functions of the mind across four main pillars. They assess perception, really hunting for those less apparent negative symptoms, alongside thinking, memory, and a patient's capacity for learning and comprehension. Think of these like the cognitive load-bearing walls of the brain. If any of these are compromised, a clinical diagnosis begins to take shape.
Section 2, a brief historical journey. I'm really excited about this section because we are taking a surprising step back in time.
The timeline of how humanity has viewed the mind is this fascinating narrative of just stark contrasts. Way back in antiquity, Hippocrates attempted to map out the mind through bodily fluids. But skip forward to the Middle Ages, and things get wild. In the West, the Dark Ages saw mental conditions met with exorcisms, literally spiritual attempts to evict demons. But right at the same time in the East, brilliant minds like Averroes and Avicenna were busy establishing Bimarstans, which were the world's very first clinical mental health units. It's such a jarring contrast. And believe it or not, it wasn't until much later, during the Enlightenment in 1808, that a German physician named Christian Johann Riehl officially coined the term psychiatry.
And this brilliantly illustrates how our ancestors tried to figure all this out. Hippocrates' four humors from antiquity represent humanity's earliest attempts to find a biological root for our behavior. He theorized that your personality was literally dictated by your fluids. In excess of blood, that made you aggressive. Black bile bred melancholy, yellow bile caused irritability, and phlegm, or saliva, resulted in introversion. Now, obviously, we've long abandoned this, but it proves that we've always instinctively known that the mind and the body's chemistry are inextricably linked. Section 3, the biopsychosocial model. This is the modern lens that finally, thankfully, replaced all that ancient mysticism.
So modern psychiatry relies on the biopsychosocial model. It treats clinical conditions like interlocking puzzle pieces. A clinician doesn't just look at that biological column, your genetics, central nervous system, neurotransmitters, or hormones. They have to map that in detail against the psychological piece, your cognition, learning processes, and personality. And then they add the social piece, how socioeconomics, migration, or even politics are affecting your reality. True clinical care only exists right at the intersection of all three of those columns.
Section 4, disorders versus diseases. Now let's talk about the mechanics of classification. You might be wondering, why do we use the word disorder instead of disease? Well, a syndrome is defined as a group of signs and symptoms that occur together and characterize a particular condition. We call mental health conditions disorders because, in a lot of cases, we just don't know the exact underlying pathological process yet. The biological why is still a bit of a mystery, so disorder is actually the most scientifically accurate term we can use right now. So when does a behavior actually become pathological? A really common misconception is that if you're statistically uncommon or socially deviant, you have a disorder. No way. That is entirely false. A condition only crosses the threshold into pathology when it is severe, frequent, persistent, and actively derails our ability to function in daily life. This is absolutely crucial to understand. Psychiatry isn't in the business of pathologizing unique personalities. It is focused entirely on treating severe, functional disruption.
Now, what's really interesting about this is how we used to categorize things. Historically, the field divided these pathologies into two main camps. First was neurosis, heavily described by Freud. This involves less severity and, crucially, preserved insight, meaning the patient is painfully aware that something is wrong, like what you see in severe anxiety or conversion disorders. Psychosis, on the other hand, pioneered by figures like Kraepelin, Schneider, and Bleuler, is far more severe because the patient lacks that insight entirely. They become totally disconnected from the reality of their condition, like we see in schizophrenia.
Section 5, Modern Diagnostic Frameworks. Let's transition to the actual tools professionals use globally today.
Today, this complex categorization is governed by two massive diagnostic frameworks. Globally, professionals rely on the World Health Organization's ICD, which is currently in its 11th edition. Meanwhile, the United States primarily utilizes the DSM, published by the American Psychiatric Association. Both of these basically serve as meticulous, evolving dictionaries of human mental health, categorizing conditions based on those severe, persistent symptoms we just talked about. To really understand the sheer scale of these modern frameworks, just look at the clinical spectrum we evaluate today. It ranges from internal mood regulators, like depressive, anxiety, and bipolar disorders, to conditions that alter reality itself, like schizophrenia and psychotic disorders. We meticulously map behavioral and developmental challenges, from ADHD and addiction all the way to the severe physiological impacts of trauma, PTSD, and eating disorders. And it keeps going. The spectrum extends even further into how we process the world and ourselves. We're talking obsessive-compulsive loops, dissociative states, somatic symptoms, and deeply ingrained personality disorders. We even categorize disruptions to our most basic human functions, from sleep-wake cycles to sexual dysfunctions, disruptive impulses, and neurocognitive decline. These 16 categories represent just a staggering clinical evolution from the days of balancing bodily humors and performing exorcisms.
We've covered a ton of ground today, but I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. Remember how we said we currently use the term disorders precisely because the exact pathological processes are still unknown to us? Well, what happens next? As neuroscience and mapping of the brain continue to advance, how will these 16 categories fundamentally evolve? Will they change completely, or perhaps even collapse into each other as science finally uncovers the true biological diseases of the mind? It is a fascinating frontier. Thank you so much for exploring it with me today. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.